the depths of the most twisted mysteries, where shadowed minds and forgotten secrets collide, a quiet storm brews, unseen and unheard by most. Here, in the dim-lit corners of village streets, behind the cold eyes of everyday people, Miss Marple uncovers the darkness that none dare face. This is no ordinary case, but one that winds its tendrils deep into the past, where sorrow and treachery linger like a curse. But there is a force even more sinister at play, a figure hidden in the canvas of time itself, a presence that no one could have foreseen. The questions echo. Who is the man behind the portrait? What does he want? What darkness is bound within that painted frame? Before we dive into the chilling narrative that will unravel this enigma, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to be part of the uncovering journey. Join Miss Marple as she ventures into the heart of this unsolved mystery. It's a journey you won't want to miss. Chapter 1. The Silent Watcher. The fog hung low over the village, cloaking the streets in an eerie silence. Even the cobblestones seemed to whisper secrets, their rough edges worn down by the passage of time. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant faint murmur of waves crashing against the far-off shore. It was here, in this small, forgotten corner of the world, that Miss Marple found herself once again, drawn into a mystery that would unravel not just the lives of those in the village, but something far darker, something that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. She stood in the doorway of the manor, her sharp eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. The walls were lined with heavy curtain, their deep crimson fabric faded with age. Dust lingered in the air like a ghost, thick and suffocating. Yet it was not the musty scent that caught her attention. No, it was the painting that hung on the far wall, a portrait of a man whose eyes seemed to follow her every movement, a gaze so unsettling that even Miss Marple, with all her years of experience, felt a fleeting chill run down her spine. The man in the portrait was no stranger to her. She had seen his likeness before, in old records and whispered rumors. But it was the way he looked at her, as though he could peer into the deepest recesses of her mind, that sent an unshakable unease into her bones. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken, with a hint of something dark lingering beneath his expression. His clothes, though fine, had a decayed elegance to them, as though time itself had begun to eat away at his memory. Miss Marple stepped closer to the painting, her eyes narrowing as she took in every detail. There was something peculiar about it, something that didn't sit right. It wasn't just the eyes. No, it was the man's posture, the slight tension in his stance, as though he was waiting for something just beyond the frame. As her gaze lingered, the room seemed to grow colder, and for a moment, the world outside the manor faded away. The sound of footsteps on the creaking floor pulled her back to the present. She turned, only to see the butler standing in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he merely gestured toward the portrait. "Do you know the story behind this painting?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, though a sense of dread gnawed at the edges of her words. The butler hesitated before nodding slowly, a nervous flicker crossing his features. "It is said to be the likeness of Lord Blackthorn, the former master of this manor," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But there are rumors, Miss Marple, dark rumors. The man in that painting, he's not who he appears to be." Rumors, Miss Marple repeated, her gaze shifting back to the portrait. What kind of rumors? The butler stepped closer, lowering his voice even further, as though the very walls might be listening. It is said that Lord Blackthorn was involved in unspeakable things, things best left forgotten. And after his death, that portrait, his likeness, was found locked in a hidden room. It was as if someone wanted to keep him alive, or perhaps to keep him trapped. Miss Marple's mind began to churn with possibilities. There was something more to this portrait, something that reached beyond mere legend. She could sense it in the air, feel it in the silence of the room. This was no ordinary painting. It was a gateway, a portal to something that had been hidden, buried beneath layers of time and deceit. Where did you find it? She asked, her voice firm now. The butler's face darkened, his gaze falling to the floor. In the old cellar behind a false wall? We thought it was lost. But now, Miss Marple, I feared it was never meant to be found. Miss Marple took one last look at the portrait, her eyes lingering on the man's hollow gaze. Whatever dark secret it held, she knew she would uncover it. She always did. And this time, the truth would be far more dangerous than any mystery she had ever faced. As the shadows outside the manor grew longer, Miss Marple turned and walked toward the door, her mind already racing with questions. What had Lord Blackthorn been involved in? And why did the portrait seem to hold so much power, even after all these years? But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The silent watcher in the painting had seen her, and now Miss Marple could feel his eyes on her wherever she went. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dust. The next morning the fog had not lifted, leaving the village encased in a shroud of mystery. Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the faint outlines of the houses across the street, their roofs barely visible through the haze. The air outside was thick and damp, but inside the small parlor where she had taken residence, the warmth of the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Her mind, however, was far from the comfort of the fire. It was the portrait that haunted her thoughts, its unsettling presence lingering like a specter in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The butler's words echoed in her mind. Things best left forgotten. What had Blackthorn done to earn such fear? Why had the portrait been hidden away in the cellar? And why did it seem as though the very act of finding it had stirred something deep within the village? Her train of thought was interrupted by a light knock at the door. She opened it to find the local librarian, a woman named Miss Hatfield, standing on the doorstep with a stack of dusty books in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and concern. Miss Marple, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I have something you may find of interest. I didn't know who else to turn to. Miss Marple motioned for her to come inside, and Miss Hatfield stepped in, placing the books carefully on the table. The titles were all old, their bindings cracked and worn, their pages yellowed with age. It was clear that Miss Hatfield had gone to great lengths to find these volumes. Do you know anything about Lord Blackthorn's estate? Miss Hatfield asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. The rumors. They're more than just tales. There's a dark history, Miss Marple, one that goes back generations. Miss Marple nodded slowly, already suspecting as much. She sat down, opening the first book. The pages were filled with accounts of the manor's early years before it fell into disrepair. The Blackthorn family was once prominent in the village, but their reputation had been tarnished by scandal and tragedy. One of the earliest entries described a lavish ball that had taken place at the manor, with the Blackthorn family at the center of it. But the joy of the evening was overshadowed by a mysterious death. A young woman, the sister of one of Blackthorn's closest allies, found dead in one of the manor's many rooms. The cause of her death was never fully determined, though many speculated it had been suicide. But there were whispers, ones that spoke of betrayal and poison, of a love triangle gone horribly wrong. And there was something else, an accusation that Lord Blackthorn had been involved, though no one had dared to speak it aloud. Miss Marple turned the page, her fingers lingering on the faded ink. The next few entries were scattered, disjointed, as though someone had purposely removed the more damning accounts. But one name continued to appear: Eliza, the sister who had died. Over the years, her name had become almost synonymous with the manor's fall from grace. Miss Marple could sense the weight of the unspoken, a truth buried beneath the dust of forgotten years. As she read further, a pattern began to emerge. The portraits of the Blackthorn family, it seemed, were not just decorative. They were bound to the family's legacy in a way that was almost unnatural. The portrait of Lord Blackthorn, which now hung in the manor, had been painted after his rise to power, but there was another, one of Eliza, which had disappeared after her death. Rumor had it that the two portraits were connected, not just by their subjects, but by a hidden force, something that had been intentionally concealed. Miss Hatfield, who had been watching Miss Marple intently, now spoke again, her voice low and cautious. "I found something else, Miss Marple. A letter. It's not much, but it's all I could uncover." She handed over an old envelope, yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front was shaky, as though the writer had been in distress. The letter was addressed to Lord Blackthorn, but there was no return address. Miss Marple carefully unfolded the letter, reading its contents in silence. The words were short, frantic, filled with fear. It was a warning, a plea to destroy the portraits, to rid the estate of the cursed images that had haunted the family for generations. But the most chilling part of the letter was the final line. "The eyes will watch until the last of you is gone. Then only the portrait will remain, and it will never forget." The words lingered in the air, and Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. The portrait, it seemed, was more than just an image. It was a silent observer, a witness to all the horrors and tragedies that had plagued the Blackthorn family. But the question remained: what did it want? And why was it tied to the manor, to Lord Blackthorn, and to the death of his sister? As she sat back, absorbing the weight of what she had uncovered, she felt a growing sense of urgency. The truth was out there, buried in the dust of the past. But uncovering it would be no easy task. There were dark forces at play, forces that had waited for decades to be uncovered. Miss Marple closed the book, her mind racing. She would need to return to the manor, to confront the portrait once again. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. The past was catching up, and Miss Marple was ready to face whatever secrets lay hidden in the shadows. Chapter 3. The Portrait's Curse. The following days unfolded slowly, with a weight in the air that felt like the onset of a storm. Miss Marple had returned to the manor in the early hours of the morning, when the world was still draped in mist and the shadows felt longer than they had the day before. The manor, though grand in its dilapidated state, stood like a sentinel to the past, unyielding and silent. But inside, it was no longer just the silence that hung heavy in the air. It was a presence, one that Miss Marple could not quite define, but she could feel it watching her from the very walls. She stepped into the grand hall, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight as she moved toward the portrait of Lord Blackthorn. The portrait, once a mere curiosity, now seemed to radiate something far darker. She could feel the eyes upon her, those hollow, empty eyes that had followed her every step since the moment she had first laid eyes on it. She was no longer sure if it was the painting or something more intangible that unsettled her. Miss Marple stood before it, her gaze unwavering. She had heard the rumors, the whispers of those who claimed the portrait was cursed. Some said that anyone who stared into the eyes of Lord Blackthorn would be driven mad. Others whispered that the portrait held a darker power, that it could reach into the soul and twist it with memories and regrets. But what Miss Marple felt was different from all the stories. She felt something pulling at her, something ancient and desperate. It was as if the portrait was calling her, beckoning her to understand its secret, to uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. As she studied the painting, she noticed a subtle shift in the air. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and her breath began to form small clouds in the cold air. The fire in the hearth had long since died out, and yet the chill remained. She could feel it creeping up her spine, an undeniable presence that seemed to seep from the very painting itself. She stepped closer to the canvas, her fingers brushing the cool wood of the frame. The man's eyes were still locked onto hers, but now she could see something new in them, an almost imperceptible flicker of movement. For a moment, it was as though the portrait had come alive, its subjects shifting ever so slightly within the confines of their painted world. It was enough to send a chill through her bones. The room seemed to constrict, the walls closing in, and for a heartbeat, she could hear a faint whisper, soft, almost like the rustling of old paper, a voice that spoke in a language she couldn't quite understand. Miss Marple took a step back, her mind reeling. Had she imagined it? Was it merely the power of suggestion that had caused her to hear something so unreal? She blinked and looked at the painting again. No, it wasn't her imagination. She could feel it, something alive within the frame. The portrait, once static, had become something far more ominous. Just as she was about to step back, the butler entered the room, his face pale and worn, as though he had not slept in days. His eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and fear, and his hands trembled as he clasped them behind his back. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you," he said, his voice strained. "It's happened again." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She had heard rumors from the villagers, whispers about those who had looked into the portrait and never been the same again. Some had gone mad, others had disappeared without a trace, leaving only empty homes and unanswered questions. She knew what the butler was referring to without needing to hear more. The curse of the portrait had begun to manifest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady, though her mind raced. The butler swallowed hard before continuing. "Another death, Miss Marple. This time, it was Mr. Hewitt, the local craftsman. He was found in his workshop, staring at the portrait. His face was contorted, his eyes wide as though he had seen something terrible. The coroner couldn't find any cause of death. But Miss Marple, the expression on his face, it was as though he had seen something that no one should ever see. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the portrait, her eyes narrowing. This was no longer just a painting. It had become a force, something that fed on the fear and suffering of those who gazed upon it. She could feel its power growing, its grip tightening on the village. But she knew that the answer lay within the portrait itself, hidden beneath layers of time and tragedy. "This curse," Miss Marple said quietly, more to herself than to the butler, "it is not simply a matter of fate or superstition. Something or someone is feeding it. The portrait is a reflection of something much darker." She turned away from the painting, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the mystery. There was no time to waste. She had to find the source of the curse, and she had to do it quickly, before more lives were claimed by the portrait's deadly gaze. As she moved toward the door, she glanced back one last time at Lord Blackthorn's portrait. His eyes still followed her, but now they held a certain clarity, as though they were waiting for her to make the next move. She had no intention of disappointing them. Chapter 4. Unveiling the Past. The days that followed were filled with a quiet urgency. Miss Marple, with her sharp intellect and methodical approach, knew that she needed to go beyond the rumors, beyond the whispers that cloaked Lord Blackthorn's legacy in shadow. To solve this mystery, she would need to dig deeper, uncovering the true nature of the curse that had ensnared so many lives before her. She returned to the manor with a sense of resolve, the chill of the previous days still lingering in the air, as though the very atmosphere had absorbed the fear and suspicion that had settled in the village. The manor was dark, its rooms heavy with dust and memories that had long since faded. Yet Miss Marple had learned by now that even the faintest trace of a forgotten truth could lead to a revelation. The first place she decided to search was the library. The large, dusty room, filled with shelves that groaned under the weight of old, brittle books, had always been a place of quiet contemplation for her. But today, it felt different, charged, as though the very air held its breath, waiting for something to be discovered. Miss Marple began to pull down the books, one by one, her eyes scanning the titles, looking for anything that might hold a clue. Most of the books were faded and irrelevant, histories of distant places, novels from forgotten authors. But as her hand brushed against one particularly worn volume, she felt a sudden tremor, almost as if the book itself had been waiting to be found. She opened it carefully, the pages crackling in protest, and began to read. The book was an old journal written by a man named Thomas Blackthorn, a distant relative of Lord Blackthorn. The entries spanned several decades, detailing the family's rise to power, their lavish parties, their business dealings. But as Miss Marple read on, she noticed something unsettling. The tone of the journal changed as time went on. The entries grew darker, filled with paranoia, fear, and cryptic references to something that had begun to take root within the family. A curse, perhaps, or a stain on their bloodline that could never be washed clean. One entry in particular caught her attention. It was dated just a few years before the death of Eliza, Lord Blackthorn's sister. The words were frantic, the handwriting shaking, as though the writer had been in a state of near madness. "It is not the portrait that is cursed. It is the blood. The portrait is but a reflection of our sins. our desires. It watches us, waits for the moment we can no longer bear the weight of the past. Eliza has seen it too. She knows what I have done. She knows what we all have done. She must never see the painting. She must never know. The words were a warning, a desperate plea to protect Eliza from whatever malevolent force was attached to the portrait. Miss Marple felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as the gravity of the words sank in. The portrait wasn't merely a witness to the Blackthorne family's tragedies. It was tied to their very bloodline, feeding off their guilt and their sins. The journal provided no clear answers, only more questions. What had Thomas Blackthorne done? And why was Eliza, the innocent victim, so tied to the painting? Miss Marple knew she would need to find out more, but the answers were not going to come easily. The deeper she dug, the more the past seemed to unravel, and the more she realized that uncovering the truth would require confronting something darker than she had ever imagined. As she closed the book, Miss Marple turned her attention to the room itself. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of secrets. Every corner seemed to whisper, every shadow seemed to hide something just out of reach. But Miss Marple wasn't afraid. No, she had seen far darker things in her time, and this was merely another puzzle waiting to be solved. Her mind was racing now, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place one by one. The portrait was more than a mere painting. It was a curse, a physical manifestation of the Blackthorne family's darkest sins, waiting to claim more lives if left unchecked. She needed to go back to the manor's cellar, to the very place where the portrait had been hidden. There, she would find the key to unlocking the mystery, the key that would either end the curse or condemn the village to a fate worse than death. As Miss Marple made her way toward the cellar, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, lurking just out of sight. But she didn't turn around. She wouldn't allow fear to guide her now. There was too much at stake, and the truth was waiting, hidden in the dark corners of the past. The door to the cellar creaked open, the smell of damp stone filling the air. Miss Marple stepped inside, the light from her lantern casting long shadows on the walls. She moved with purpose, her every step measured, her mind focused on the task ahead. She knew that what she was about to uncover could change everything. But she was ready. She always was. Chapter 5. The Haunting Revelation. The cold air of the cellar wrapped around Miss Marple like a cloak, biting into her skin, but she paid it no mind. There was no time for discomfort, no time for fear. Her every instinct told her that she was getting closer, that the answers were within reach. The flickering light from her lantern cast eerie shadows against the stone walls, the long, twisted shapes dancing like spirits, desperate to be seen. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. But there was something else now, something sharp, as if the very atmosphere was charged with the weight of history. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her boots softly echoing on the cold stone floor as she navigated the labyrinth of forgotten rooms. She had been here before, but this time the cellar felt different. It felt as though something was watching her, something from the darkness, waiting for her to discover the final secret. The hairs on her neck prickled, but her resolve remained unshaken. The truth was within her grasp. The passageway to the hidden room was narrow, barely wide enough for her to slip through. Miss Marple's breath came in soft, steady puffs as she made her way down the corridor, each step taking her further into the heart of the manor's deepest secrets. She could feel the weight of the past bearing down on her with every step, each moment feeling heavier than the last. The further she ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. The world above, the village, the people, the life she had known, seemed distant now, like a dream fading into the mist. At the end of the passage, she found the familiar wooden door, the one she had once opened, only to find the portrait of Lord Blackthorn staring back at her. But this time, something felt different. This time, the air around her was thick with anticipation, as though the door itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple placed her hand on the cold wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingers, and slowly pushed it open. The door creaked in protest, the sound echoing through the stone room like the cry of an old, forgotten soul. As the door swung wide, Miss Marple stepped inside, her lantern casting its warm glow across the room. But what she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. There, in the center of the room, was the painting. Lord Blackthorn's portrait, framed and pristine, as though it had never been touched by time. Yet this was not the same portrait she had seen in the manor above. No, this was different. The eyes of the man in the painting glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light that pulsed with an eerie rhythm, as though the painting itself were alive. It was as if the portrait were breathing, its subject caught in an eternal, haunting stare. For a moment, Miss Marple stood frozen, her mind racing to understand what she was seeing. She had known there was something unnatural about the portrait, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The curse was not just a matter of tragic history. It was a living, breathing force, one that had grown more powerful with time, feeding off the sorrow and guilt of the Blackthorn family and their dark deeds. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the portrait, feeling an unsettling pull toward it, as though it were drawing her in. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her like a storm. The voice of the painting, no longer merely a whisper, seemed to speak directly to her. "You have come far, Miss Marple, but you will never leave. You cannot escape what has already been set in motion." The words sent a cold shiver through her body, and for the first time, Miss Marple felt a flicker of doubt, a brief moment where she wondered if she was truly in control of the situation. But then, as quickly as the doubt arrived, it was replaced by clarity. She had always known the risks. She had always known that the truth would come at a price. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. "Why this portrait? Why has it endured all these years?" The voice, or whatever force lay behind the painting, seemed to answer, though its words were not spoken aloud. The answer came in a flood of images, visions of the Blackthorn family, their rise to power, their indulgences, and the dark secrets they had hidden from the world. The portrait, she realized, was not just a reflection of their image. It was a reflection of their sins, their guilt, their eternal damnation. The painting had bound itself to them, and now it was bound to her as well. The curse was not merely a curse of death or madness. It was a curse of remembrance. The portrait kept the sins of the past alive, forever trapped in its painted frame, feeding off the souls of those who had the misfortune to look into its eyes. Lord Blackthorn's face, the man who had once been so powerful, was now a prisoner to his own image, his soul eternally trapped within the portrait, unable to escape the legacy of his own sins. Miss Marple closed her eyes, gathering herself for what was to come. She had known this was coming. She had known that the curse would not release its hold on the village so easily. But there was one thing she could still do, one thing that could end it all. With a steady hand, she reached out and touched the frame of the portrait. As her fingers made contact, a surge of energy coursed through her, sharp and electric, like the final jolt of a long-forgotten memory. She held her breath, feeling the power of the painting pulse through her, but she didn't falter. The painting's power had grown with every passing year, fed by the fear, the guilt, and the unanswered questions of those who had come before. But Miss Marple understood now. The only way to break the curse was to expose it, to reveal the sins that had given the portrait its power. She would not allow this darkness to continue, not while she still had the strength to fight. With one final breath, she closed her eyes and whispered the words that would sever the portrait's hold on the family, on the village, and on the past. The portrait's eyes, those sickly yellow eyes, flickered one last time, and the room fell silent. The whispers stopped, the air cleared, and the darkness that had haunted the manor for so long seemed to lift. Miss Marple opened her eyes to find the portrait no longer glowing. It was just a painting, its lifeless eyes now dull and empty, a mere reflection of the past, trapped in the frame where it belonged. She had done it. The curse was broken. But as Miss Marple turned to leave the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past, no matter how much it was buried, would always find a way to surface again. For in every shadow, in every forgotten corner of history, there would always be another portrait waiting to be uncovered.